Well, hello and a very warm welcome to this week's Geraldine Jamieson interview. Now, my guest today will be instantly recognisable to one and all. He entered the House of Commons in 1984, was a minister for 11 years and had 3 positions in the Cabinet, including Secretary of State for Defence. Since leaving politics, he has devoted himself to writing and broadcasting. He is, of course, Michael Portillo. Well, now, a very warm welcome indeed to the programme, Michael.
Great pleasure to be with you, thank you.
Well, it's lovely to catch up with you here in person on the Isle of Man. Did you always have political aspirations?
No, I had them intermittently. I was very interested in politics as a child. My family was very political. My father was a refugee from the Spanish Civil War. He was therefore a man of the left, and my family were Labour supporters, and I got drawn into that. I had a photograph of Harold Wilson on my bedroom wall when I was a kid, and I used to help run Labour Party committee rooms when I was in my teens. But then when I was at university, which is the time when people usually develop their political careers, I did not. I showed no interest in politics at university. When I left university, I found myself at a bit of a loose end, and a friend said to me, you know, what you really ought to be doing is working for the Conservative Party Research Department. I took that on, and the rest is history, as they say.
Well, you worked closely with Margaret Thatcher, particularly in the run-up to the 1979 election, when you were responsible for briefing her before press conferences. Now, as a young player in the political game, this must have been an enormous learning course for you, surely.
Yeah, it was a great privilege to be able to do it. And I certainly learned a great deal. I was about 25 at the time, and there I was briefing the lady who was the leader of the opposition, but I could see day by day was metamorphosing into the Prime Minister, because every day it became clearer that she was going to win the general election. I interpreted my role as being to bring all the bad news that I could to her every morning so that she would be prepared for any eventuality. And I was then rather upset when she said to me, you know, you're bringing me all this bad news, you're battering me. I may be leader of the opposition, but I need a bit of bucking up as well, you know. And I learnt quite a lot there. I mean, I learnt straight away, as it were, the loneliness of the position of people who are leaders of parties, leader of the opposition, Prime Minister. And the loneliness is because all the decisions in the end are their responsibility. And the people who mainly surround them are called their colleagues, but they're not. They're their rivals for office, and they're their subordinates. And so they are rather lonely. And it's quite interesting. I've just seen the Meryl Streep film of Margaret Thatcher, and it's a highly controversial film. A lot of it is about loneliness. And one of the things I thought was very striking about the film is it's not just about her loneliness in old age. It's also really about her loneliness when she was Prime Minister. And it is the loneliness of being the only person who is responsible for a decision. And in her case, it was also the loneliness of being in a world of men.
Well, of course, you mean she did have a husband.
She did. And he was a fantastic support to her. By the way, that's one of the things that emerges very, very strongly in the new film. But in a way, you underline my point. She, and other leaders too, I think, have to look outside the grouping of their colleagues for the support that makes it possible for them to do the job.
Well, with Mrs. Thatcher becoming the first female Prime Minister in the UK and bringing with her new policies and philosophies, did you feel this was a changing time for politics?
No, absolutely. I thought we were part of a revolution. It was the most exciting thing to be part of. And we were a young group of people who began outside the House of Commons, and then during the 80s came into the House of Commons, and then became her junior ministers. We were a sort of phalanx. Part of our philosophy was that the Ted Heath government had made a great mistake by making a U-turn halfway through and going back on all its previous policies. So there was a grouping called the No Turning Back Group. We were the No Turning Back Group. And by and large, Margaret Thatcher didn't turn back. She saw it through to its culmination. Although perhaps I should say straight away that actually she was much more of a tactician. She was much more willing to tack towards her destination than many people remember. Her rhetoric was very tough and unidirectional, but she was a bit cleverer about arriving at her destination than many people remember.
Of course, she was known, wasn't she, as the Iron Lady. Working closely with her, did you get to see a softer or more vulnerable side to her character?
I'm not sure that I saw much vulnerability until the end. Soft, yes, but she divided the world into two halves, not equal halves. There were those people who were around her who were in politics, and they were meant to be tough enough to take whatever she meted out. And she meted out a lot to those people. And in the end, it was too much for some people, I think of Sir Geoffrey Howe, to take. They couldn't bear the way she treated them. And sometimes, to be honest, she treated them pretty badly with scant courtesy. But everyone who was outside that inner circle of politics, she treated with great respect. Again, in the new film by Meryl Streep, you'll see her writing letters, it's absolutely true, to the families of those who lost their lives in the Falklands War. I remember being with her at a party where a waitress dropped a tray of drinks and the Prime Minister fell to her knees to help the girl pick up the broken pieces of glass to make her feel, better about the accident that had occurred. So that's it. If you were in the game of politics, if you were a consenting adult in that game, you had to be prepared to be treated the way she thought was right.
Well, in 1984, you won the by-election for Enfield Southgate. I'm sure you must remember that moment really well.
I do. Of course, it had a tragic background because the vacancy had occurred because one member of Parliament was killed in the Brighton bombing of October 1984, and I filled his place. My by-election was so emotional in a way that at first there was doubt whether it ought to be contested by the other parties at all. Should we allow the IRA to bomb a party out of power? Because, by-elections could be very volatile. If the Labour Party won the by-election, would that have been an incentive to the IRA to kill more members of Parliament? So it was an emotional and a controversial by-election. But certainly I remember being elected, and of course I felt very pleased to have been elected, but the sombre circumstances of the by-election were pretty important at the time. And by then, too, we were into the miners' strike. So it was not really a time for great festivities.
As well as the miners' strike in full swing, it was the actual process of privatisation. And these were changing times indeed. But was it an exciting part, for the Conservative Party then?
It was very exciting. You're right that privatisation was underway, but it had taken time. The Conservatives were in office in their first Parliament from 1979 to 1983 and made almost no progress with privatisation. They did begin to get on with it in the second Parliament. And I remember I was put on the committee in the House of Commons considering the gas bill, which was the bill to privatise the gas industry. It was the flagship bill of that Parliament. And that Christmas, I went to the Christmas party at 10 Downing Street, and the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, said to me, "Now, what's on your mind now, Michael?" And I said, "Well, just at the moment, Prime Minister, the gas bill." She said, "The gas bill, yes, it's always a worry at this time of year." "Oh, the gas bill!" Although she was Prime Minister, she really thought that when I talked about the gas bill, it was because I was having difficulty paying the bill from the gas company. It just shows that she was always rather down to earth.
The female instincts actually were coming through. When you lost your seat, though, in 1997, did you consider giving up politics for good? Or did you always hope to return to the political arena?
No, I assumed that I had given up politics for good. And when I thought about it in prospect, I thought that if I lost my seat, I would not try to return. I then changed my mind. There was a day when another member of Parliament died, and he was Alan Clark. And in that moment, I thought, that seat of Kensington and Chelsea, I love that place. It would be such a privilege to be the member for that. And I decided in that instant that I would offer myself for election at Kensington and Chelsea. And in a way, that was a good decision because I loved being the member for Kensington and Chelsea. But to be honest with you, I did not enjoy my return to the House of Commons for the following 5 years. So in that respect, perhaps it was a mistake. All I can say is that when I next left the House of Commons in 2005, I left of my own volition. And that felt kind of psychologically better to me than having been booted out in 1997.
Well, you returned to the Commons, as you said, in 1999. But if you had been able to stand for the leadership of the Conservative Party, what would you have brought as party leader, do you feel?
Had I stood in 1997, had I been re-elected in 1997 to the House of Commons and stood then, I would have offered them the sort of reform programme that David Cameron took up during his years in opposition. In other words, I would have tried to move the Conservative Party to the centre ground. I would have emphasised the need to talk about the issues that were important to people, which were the education of their children, the National Health Service, the environment, and to get the Conservative Party off its obsessions with, for example, tax cutting at any price and the question of Europe, which, though terribly important, does have that feeling of being an obsessive ideological issue, which I think tends to put off the public. I would not have prospered with any of this. I mean, firstly, the Conservative Party was not by any means ready to hear that message. And in any case, whoever led the Conservative Party after 1997 would have been massacred in 2001 because the tide was flowing very strongly in favour of the Labour Party. The Conservative government was massively unpopular after 18 years in office. And the tide was bound to be out, that is to say, against the Conservative Party for a decade. That was my calculation at the time.
Well, what led to your decision to stand down from the House of Commons at that 2005 election?
Well, I had offered myself for the leadership in 2001, and I hadn't got it. I did offer the reform programme, I would say pretty similar to what David Cameron did some years later. The Conservative Party clearly wasn't ready for it. I came third in that election, and Ian Duncan Smith was the successful candidate. And I thought really that I would simply be in the way if I remained, because I was a high-profile figure, and let's face it, quite a controversial figure. And while I was there was always going to be talk of, the prince across the water, and was I coming back, and was I making trouble? And I thought, well, the only way of resolving all these things is to leave, and then it's perfectly clear that I'm not interested in the leadership anymore. And also, I could see that the Conservatives were going to be out for quite a bit longer, and I couldn't see myself going through really all my 50s, kicking my heels on the off chance that I might be Foreign Secretary at the end of it. It just didn't seem like the right deal for me.
Well, an interesting time for politics right now, with the coalition government being formed. You must have watched that general election with great interest.
I did. I was always convinced that the Conservatives could not win it. I was very often a minority voice in saying that. But I could see from the polls and the state of public opinion that the Conservatives were not going to win. I thought that a hung parliament was much the most likely outcome. I underestimated David Cameron and George Osborne because I didn't foresee the readiness with which the day after the general election they would form the coalition with the Liberal Democrats. I thought it was exactly the right thing to do. In fact, that morning I was writing an article saying if only they had offered a coalition to the Liberal Democrats, that would have been the right thing. They did it magnificently. I say David Cameron and George Osborne because I think George is largely the strategist. And during the general election campaign, I think he'd had time to think through what was going to happen if they didn't win the general election. And I have been delighted with the coalition. And its most important period actually was the first 72 hours after the general election, when both the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives were clearly convinced by the civil servants that they had to have a credible programme of austerity to tackle the deficit, because otherwise there was the danger that the markets weren't going to fund the British deficit and that the interest rates would go up, that Britain would lose its AAA credit rating, that there'd be a run on the pound. By forming a coalition and committing themselves to the austerity programme, none of those things happened. And to this day, we have the advantage that we are paying about 2% on our government borrowings by comparison with Spain and Italy, who are paying 7 and 8%. And that remains a fundamental advantage. And bringing us right up to date, in the autumn statement, George Osborne has clearly felt the imperative need not to lose this hard-won advantage. He feels that if he slackens the austerity package at all, the markets will take fright. That's his judgment, but I understand perfectly what it's based on. It was based on that experience in the first 72 hours after the last general election, when he was convinced by the civil servants that he needed to do that. And Nick Clegg was convinced too, and that's remarkable.
But the ordinary man in the street surely isn't just as clear in his head about all this as obviously your good self is.
Well, there are lots of people who would argue with me. Most of them are called Ed Balls, Ed Miliband. They would argue with what I've just said too. No, your point about the man on the street is an important one. Let's face it, if this coalition wins at the next election, either fighting together or if the Conservatives fight separately, if they're going to win at the next election, it's not going to be because they have won a popularity contest. The only way they would win would be the way that Margaret Thatcher used to win. That is to say that people would say, well, what they've done is terrible and I hate it and I don't like them, but I do think they're doing the difficult but necessary thing. That is the only basis on which these people can survive in politics. So what they're doing now is the difficult thing. What they argue is the necessary thing. They hope the British public will be convinced that it was necessary.
Well, getting back to you yourself personally, Michael, you very much remain in the public eye with regular television and radio appearances. And one of your most successful projects has been the BBC Two series, Great British Railways. Tell us how about the series came about, and you obviously have a great passion for trains.
The series came about because a lady in an independent production company which makes the series had a brother-in-law who was an antiquarian bookseller. And one day he produced this Bradshaw's Guide. It's an 1860s guide written by a man called George Bradshaw, or rather by his company, which tells tourists how to proceed around the country travelling by train. And this lady said, well, there's a television series in this. In fact, there have already been 3 television series in this, and I hope there are going to be still more. And how did they pick me? Because more than a decade before that, I had made a railway journey, for BBC Two, in a series called Great Railway Journeys. And I travelled around Spain telling the story of my father in the Spanish Civil War. And I was lucky that somebody remembered that I'd done that and said, oh, well, you know, if you're going to do a railway journey, Michael Portillo's your man. Now, as for my passion for trains, I mean, I throw myself into it with great enthusiasm, but I've never been a train spotter. And I'm not much used to the viewer who's interested in identifying, you know, numbers of trains or how many bogies or what age the locomotive is. You know, I just generally think that getting around by train is a very nice way to travel.
I believe one of your favourite journeys was the Settle to Carlisle line. Now, that particular line has a personal resonance for you, doesn't it?
It certainly does. I was Minister of Transport at one time. And, of course, the Conservative government had an attitude towards the nationalised industries. In those days, the railways were nationalised, which was that they should be as efficient as possible. And in this spirit, British Rail came to me and they said, well, if you want us to be as efficient as possible, we should close the Settle to Carlisle line, because the infrastructure is very old. It was built in the 1870s, very difficult to maintain, and nobody's using the line. Well, there was such a hullabaloo about this. There was an organisation locally called the Friends of the Settle Carlisle Line Association, and they said, come on everyone, you better travel on the line this summer because it looks like it's going to get closed. So 350,000 people travelled on it that summer, transforming the economics of the line. And also, we managed to find out that the famous Ribblehead Viaduct could be repaired for much less than I had been led to believe. And I also knew that although the Conservatives believed in the nationalised industries, you know, being as efficient as possible, we also believe in heritage and history. And so with this package, that on the one hand, more people were using the line and it wasn't going to cost as much to maintain as before, and that we ought to be interested in heritage, I was able to go to the Prime Minister and convince her that the Settle to Carlisle line should be kept open. And I'm the proud signatory of the letter that says that it shall remain open.
Wonderful, wonderful stuff indeed. Now, you've been on the island filming for the next series. How did it go?
It went, on the whole, very well. I arrived on a tranquil blue sea on the ferry, on this steam packet, and travelled on the horse tram along the promenade. And the next day, I was talking to Terry Kringle about the occupation of the boarding houses along the promenade during the war by those who were deemed to be enemy aliens. And then we were filming in the mine railway at Laxey, the Bee and the Ant, and we were filming the magnificent water wheel there. And then eventually we ascended Snay Fell on the electric tram. Now, at that point, our luck ran out because the god Manannan had his cloak out that day, was protecting the island. And as I ascended, I was looking forward to my view of the Seven Kingdoms. And when I actually got there, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. So this makes a curious climax, for it is the climax of the series. It will be the last programme in the series. And you don't normally climax with something that hasn't gone according to plan. So the series ends with me disappearing into a mist, which means I take a step of about 2 or 3 feet because that's how thick the mist was up there. Well, I hope people will think it's quite a good joke, really.
It was very sporting of you, actually, to give us, the opportunity of hearing it all first. Talking of documentaries, surprised me to find out there have been so many subjects, really diverse, that you have followed up. They sort of range from Richard Wagner and even the death penalty.
Yes. When I was a tiny bit younger than I am now, a number of directors tried to involve me in what's called immersive presenting, which was very much in vogue. That is to say, the presenter has to be willing to undergo all sorts of difficulties and tests. So, for example, we did one on the death penalty. What we were looking at was, whether there was a better way, if you're going to execute people, which, most of us don't anymore, but the United States still does, whether the lethal injection, which is used in most states, is the most humane way of doing it. We found pretty convincingly that it was not. But in the process, I was gassed to see whether gas might be more humane. Naturally, I wasn't gassed with the gas they used to kill prisoners, but there was a point to it. And I was deprived of oxygen in 2 different methods because we were groping towards the idea that actually, if you induce hypoxia, which is taking oxygen out of the brain, that is a very painless way of killing people. So I subjected myself to 2 hypoxic incidents, enough to be able to tell you that indeed, when oxygen is taken away from your brain, you simply become euphoric and irresponsible.
My goodness. Well, finally, do you miss the daily life of a politician?
I don't. I enjoyed most of it while I was there. Particularly, I enjoyed government. And some people say, well, I bet you wouldn't want to be there now because it's all so difficult. That's not so. I think when it's difficult is when it's interesting, when it's challenging, actually when it's fun. And although I have sympathy for the difficulties that my former colleagues are going through, I know that actually they are rising to the occasion and they're probably getting a huge buzz out of it. But I don't miss it simply because I did it for about 20 years and I feel that that was enough. And I feel quite strongly that it's a great privilege to have had 2 careers, to have 2 experiences in life. I wouldn't want to be on my deathbed and look back and think, well, I only ever tried one thing during my life. So now at least I've tried 2 things.
Well, I hope it's a long, long time before you're anywhere near a deathbed or giving up and enchanting us in some way or other. Michael Portillo, it has been so rewarding to catch up with you in person. Thank you indeed for joining me on this week's Geraldine Jamieson interview. And do come back to our island again soon.
Thank you, Geraldine. You may count on it.
And our thanks to the Isle of Man Sporting and Dining Club, who have announced that their next event will be an evening with Julian Lloyd-Webber, Travels with My Cello, at the Gaiety Theatre on the 13th of September next year. And Geraldine's guest next Tuesday evening will be the New Zealand classical singer Hayley Westenra.